Okay, in Chapter 12, we're going to talk about how do we repay victims. So how are victims repaid? The preferred method here would be obviously to have the offender make direct restitution, but sometimes this happens through a civil suit, through an insurance company, victim compensation programs, or profits from quote-unquote notorious criminals. So what does restitution by an offender look like? Well, if they still have possession of stolen goods, those may be returned. If not, they may have to pay an equivalent amount of money or perform some type of direct services. Types of restitution can include community service, symbolic restitution, or creative restitution. So let's think about restitution. Restitution exists throughout our history. It's in the Code of Hammurabi, under Roman law, under early American law. And our court system becomes, that a crime is no longer really committed against the victim. It's committed against the state. In 1982, the President's Task Force on Victims and Crime made a recommendation for restitution to be paid by offenders. And in 1994, it became mandatory in federal cases of sexual assault and domestic violence. And so courts in every state do have the right to order restitution. So restitution could include things like medical and counseling costs, replacement of property, lost wages due to injuries, funeral expenditures, and all kinds of other direct costs. What is the purpose here, though? So the purpose is, on one hand, to repay the victims, but also to rehabilitate offenders and to provide some type of reconciliation. And finally, it is also still a means of punishment, and some of our early means of punishment were fines. The first priority is to incarcerate to repay the debt to society, and then the second is to make efforts to repay the victim. Incarceration and restitution are not compatible. When someone is incarcerated, they're not really able to make restitution. So here we can see opportunities for offenders to make restitution. What about in the immediate aftermath of the criminal event versus final stages of involvement? So this could be informal. It could be directly arranged between a victim of an offender or with a police officer exercising discretion. It may be more formal. It might be part of a pretrial diversion or a condition of avoiding prosecution. Could be part of a plea bargain, part of sentencing. And then, of course, it could be a condition of early release and parole. So remember, we talked about case attrition and sort of this funnel process through the criminal justice system. Here we can kind of see what we also talk about as the leaky net. So there's the criminals who do actually repay their victims, and then those who are sort of falling out at different parts of the stages of the system, stages of the process, who don't repay their victims. So restitution is imposed in a very small amount of violent crimes, 13% of murder cases, 18% of rape, sexual assault, and aggravated assault, but it is higher for property crimes. It's ordered in about 27% of burglaries and 29% of fraud cases. So some things to think about, though, is economic realities. Just because I order somebody to pay restitution doesn't mean they have the means to do so. So when we think about these, some programs are victim-oriented. Their goal is to make the victims whole, while others are offender-oriented, would talk about rehabilitation. And a system-oriented process would be talking about how this helps reduce costs of incarceration. We don't really know what's the best way to evaluate these programs. There's sort of pros and cons to each approach. And here we can see percentages of convicted felons who got restitution in the 75 largest jurisdictions nationwide. So victims can also go after an offender in civil court. So torts are private injuries, private wrongs between two parties. And the plaintiff in this case would be the victim. They would sue somebody and they might be looking for compensatory damages that are meant to compensate you for the actual loss. And then you may also ask in some cases for punitive damages, which is additional monies that basically are serving as a punishment to the offender. The plaintiff would file the complaint, which is called a pleading, noting any jurisdictional issues and the reason they believe they have cause for action. Then the defendant would be summoned to court and they have to respond within a stated period of time. There would be a discovery process where evidence would be provided to both sides. And if a suit does result, the civil suit usually occurs after a criminal trial. The burden of proof is different in a civil court. It's preponderance of the evidence, which means it's more likely than not that the person did commit the civil infraction. Some of the challenges here: it takes a long time to go to criminal court. It takes an even longer time to go to civil court, and it could take years to repay. A victim may turn around and countersue. What's more important here is having a really good attorney, and many criminals don't have resources to pay a judgment ordered in civil court. So you could go to court and you could win. Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman's families have won a judgment against O.J. Simpson, and I believe none of it's been paid. We could also sue a business, right? If they've been negligent, they may have created an opportunity for a crime to happen, or they may not have acted to prevent foreseeable crimes. Had they had complaints in the past of certain things that they didn't address? Did they not post warnings? Did they refuse to provide and improve their security, or not offer appropriate protection? So almost half of third-party lawsuits are brought by rape victims. When we sue the government, the standard here is gross negligence, because the government's a sovereign immunity. Things we might see somebody sue for here is malfeasance or nonfeasance, wrongful escape, failure to warn, and wrongful release. But it's a little bit harder to sue the government than to sue a business or to sue another individual. Insurance policies can also reimburse victims: life insurance, homeowners insurance, disability insurance, and auto insurance. If you look at your auto insurance policy, you probably have some insurance on there for not only you causing damage to another person's car, but you causing damage to another person. We also have victims' compensation programs run by the government. And there's a bunch of different reasons for this. Usually, offenders, when they're sentenced to court, almost all offenders have to pay a fine into the Victims' Compensation Fund. And the Victims' Compensation Fund can help with all different kinds of costs incurred as a result of being a victim. VOCA is the Victims of Crime Act. It was passed in 1984 and established those first compensation funds. And as I mentioned, it's done through fines and penalties and forfeitures. By 1993, every state had a fund. So they only compensate innocent victims, and for serious crimes only. This was part of the information we would often provide, that a medical advocate will and a doctor will often provide in the emergency room in the aftermath of a sexual assault, is how to apply for that. They don't replace goods unless they're essential, and only out-of-pocket expenses are reimbursed. So the first thing they're going to do is go to your insurance and to someone else's insurance for that, and then they might be able to help reimburse you. So as I mentioned, they won't pay if insurance pays. Restitution is subtracted from that. Groups can receive awards: families of a DUI victim or domestic violence. Groups that are excluded, though: police, fire, parolees, probationers, and prisoners. And some states also allow for pain and suffering. So how do we evaluate whether or not these are good? We can look at the process, how the process works, how does the program work, how productive is it, or the impact it makes. We could compare their intentions with its actual accomplishments. What does it intend to do, and what does it actually do? And do those things match, and how well do they match? So for process evaluation, most claims for DUIs, homicides, rapes, robberies, and child abuse. It takes anywhere from 1 month to 24 months. Most eligible victims never apply, so about 55% never apply. In 2010, the U.S. paid out $500 million to violent crime victims, with assault victims being the largest group receiving aid. When we think about impact, there's no evidence that the program is encouraging victims to report and cooperate with the criminal justice system. Doesn't seem to be reducing public discontent with the criminal justice system. About 3/4 of those applying will not apply again if victimized. Public supports this program, but doesn't really understand that victims are often dissatisfied with it. And often takes a long time. You often have to pay out of pocket first, produce receipts, and then get reimbursed. Another thing we do is we have laws like the Son of Sam law. And New York passed this in 1977. It basically prevents criminals from making money from writing a book or a movie. 42 states and the federal government has similar laws. In 1991, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned it based on free speech limitations. But basically what happens now is the laws are changed so that any profits from that, assets of criminals are often given to families of victims. And that wraps up Chapter 12.